Oh hey, welcome to another edition of Hand-Laid Tracks and 3D Printed Trains with Socrates. Today we're looking at number 4 Turnout. I was making my turnouts using the Fast Tracks Jigs. It's a great company, they got great products. It's how I started the whole process. The metal jig, made a little 3D printed clamp system to go around it because I like my clamps. And it worked okay. I made a whole bunch of curved tracks back there. There's a whole bunch of unique tracks, but I use this for a bunch of different, I think there's about 5 turnouts on there. And I was using it recently, and I kind of found that it was too much of a heat sink. I was gotten used to soldering on plastic jigs, and, because this is the jigs I use, and I couldn't really get the darn frog to go right. So I decided I'd make myself a number 4 jig and system. So this is first turnouts I'm making using my own jigs. For the number 4 anyway. So I have the jig and a whole bunch of different things to make the whole process easier. So you got your main jig itself, in this case the right hand turn. Let's see here. Rail cutter to help you cut the rails, makes that a little easier. You can see a little hole in the end where the rail is and it helps poke it out and get the rail out of there. The most annoying task for the most part is cutting the ties. So I made these little tie cutters and gappers, so you put the tie in there and you can cut them off to length and then you can gap them. This is a really, really useful tool. And since on the jig here is how you make your frogs, sort of use the frog in the middle there. So I had to make a little frog jig so you can make your frogs as well. It sort of melts, but as long as you let it cool off, it's come fine. I think there's at least 1 or 2 done from here. And then there's also a way to bend your guardrails as well. Of course, you're going to need to cut your frog points and your points and your points and frogs, frog points, your frog points. So I have this little jig here. You put your rails inside. The ends, put them to the right length. Take them back off. Go ahead and use your file and file them down. And these have been used I'm not sure how many times, but quite a few. And hold up pretty well. I was using the Fast Tracks stock rail cutter, but I figured if you're using this you need a stock rail cutter too, so I made a stock rail cutter as well. Works pretty well from what I can find. I made a couple stock rails off of it. And in the end, you're going to have to cut your isolation cuts in the middle there so as to isolate the frog turnouts. So I made this little jig, goes behind the track, and you have a little sacrificial that goes there as well, and you cut through the sacrificial, and that helps to cut your isolation cuts using a jeweler's saw. Fantastic thing. And here's the whole process of making it, so you can make your own number 4 turnouts for N scale and make yourself some tracks. It's great fun. Here comes the whole building process. Took about 2 hours front to back. This is sped up, and the MSR, what is it, I can't remember, the ASMR version is going to be on here as well. So thanks for watching it. Check it out. So let's make us a piece of track using some rails, tie beds, a whole bunch of time. In the end, you end up with a piece of track, which is pretty cool. So I washed the rails off with alcohol and just a simple piece of paper towel, clean off the rails. I saw there's a lot of gunk coming off of them, so clearly there's something on it. And with the rail cutter, you can cut your rails to length pretty quickly. Of course, it's slightly long, but it makes it a lot easier to snap out your rails real fast. And you can see them in the little holes, so you can use a thing to poke them out if necessary. And first step is usually making the frog. I have a little frog, because basically I used to use that Fast Tracks jig, which is very nice, but I found it to be too much of a heat sink, so I needed to replace all the parts of it, and one of them is the frog maker, and it also has a little hole for the guardrails, so you can put your guardrails hole, and this is the length of the guardrail, and you can put them in, they don't go in deeply, and you bend it, and you can make it into the shape of the frog. And you want to also go ahead and you gotta knock just a little bit off the edge of the rail. It's one of the nicest things about making your own tracks. There's that little tiny corner where the wheels go in, and you sort of round that off, so when the wheels come in it's nice and rounded. I really like that. And then you have to cut your stock rails and frog rails and point rails, and that's the one to make the point rails and frog rails. It's a nice little thing. It comes apart. They go in both rails at the same time. All four rail goes in all at once. They go against themselves, flange to flange. You push that on to make sure they're in the right place. Tighten it down, take them back off, and then go ahead and use the file. I try to go about 5 to 12 times one way, then 5 to 12 times the other way, and then I go down. If I did like 12, 12, I'll do 10, 10, 8, 8, or 4, 4, down, down, down. You want to make sure it's nice and flat on the edge. And I've used this a bunch of times, and it's held up pretty darned well. And then you kind of poke them out of there. It can be a little trouble to get things out of everything, but they all come out fairly easily if you're calm. Use another rail to push it out, basically. And then I went and cleaned up clean the points up. And you want to always make sure they kind of round it. It's, again, something so nice you can do with it. It's a little tiny thing, but you can round it so the wheels go in easier. And for solder, I went through a whole bunch of different solders, and I found this is the by far the best solder. And Stanoil, I don't know. I'm in Europe. I think it might be German. And again, you can see me sort of cleaning up the tip of the frog, so you can kind of make it so it's nice and rounded up, etc. So then all the ties come off the tie bed, and you can snip these down. What I usually do is once I step to one half, I'll go ahead and clean up the other half so you can put it in the jig and flip it. And I use this is one of my favorite things I made, because this is such a pain to do otherwise. You need a tie cutter and gapper. So this is a 2-part jig. So first you put them in the yellow part all the way down, cut them off, and then use the file. I use the big file. This is the one I got from Fast Tracks, and still my favorite big file. Go down the end, and then I clean it off with a little brush to make sure you get all the parts off in the box back behind me. And then you take them out one at a time, and you slip them from the first jig into the second jig. And then once they're in that jig, you can go through real quickly with a triangle file and zam, zam, zam. And I actually was using the Fast Tracks triangle file for a long time, but recently I got a one, again, from a German company. I'll link it in the group. I find it to be a little bit better. It's a little bit tighter. And then you have all your things gapped out real fast, because that's one of the hardest process is to gap these stupid little ties. And then recently I was using the Fast Track stock jig for a long time because it works perfectly well. But I figured if you're doing it like this, you need a stock jig. So I made a stock rail cutting jig. You put your stock rails in it one at a time, and you basically take off the flange from the stock rail, and it's worked pretty darn well. I only use it for a couple tries now, but it worked pretty darn well, and no issues there. And then you put your stock rails in. Once they've been cut, you figure out where you're going to put them. And these rails are supposed to be not too much longer, because I'm not trying to waste much more than necessary. And the curved rail, you sort of bend with your thumb a little bit. You kind of zoop, zoop, zoop it. The ASMR version has it all done in real time, so you can watch me do all this same video slowly. It's a 2-hour video or something like that. And the next thing is the point rails. And the point rails also were cut using the point rails we cut already when we did our frogs and our points, so we already cut them. And you have to make a little notch in it and then bend it. And you can see where the notch and the bend is on the jig. It sort of has I have to add a mark to it. That's a good point. And basically, you cut the end off. And again, use a little rounding thing to make it fit so nice and so perfectly. And then this is me cleaning up the point edges just a little bit to make them fit so much better. And then you put all your pieces one at a time into the jig itself. They all fit in. They're sort of aligned with the jig, so with the pieces, so they go one, 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 one. And on the end of this, I have there's a couple extra normal pieces on the end, so I added them to the cutting thing. And so I put all the pieces in. I put the frogs in. I put the stock rails, not the guard rails, but I put the frog, the stock, and the diverging rails all in at once. Then I used my various clamps. There's 3 sets of clamps, small, medium, and large, and they fit on the 3 gaps on the jig, and make sure it fits with the coupler, with the rolling coupler. And I also have a little train, that little white one, that's the most complaining of all my locos. So I make sure that goes through cleanly, and then basically first you do the stock rails. I do the round side first, because that way you can push them all the way to the other end. You want to make sure that the gaps are in the right place too, because it's a little bit of finicky with the gaps. But then you do your outer rails, and you can see I've done the stock rails already. And once the stock rails are done, you do the diverging rails, which is just basically the turning rails, and that's only around the frog. And after that, you do the frog itself, and you can see me doing the frog. And with the frog, there's only the 2 solders that are on the inside of the rail, which you really want to make sure you don't mess up, because that's where the wheel comes by. And that's one of the nice things about the plastic. It forces you to be quick with your heat. And you can see me, that's doing the inside rail at that point, which is the toughest of all the solder joints to do. And at that point, it's mostly done. Checking it with the white loco, and then put in your guardrails. And with the guardrails, you use a discarded piece or a short piece of the tie, and you stick it between the guardrail and the normal rail, and you put your first tack down and make sure it's lined up, and that gives you the right spacing for the wheel, the flange to go through. And then tighten that up. I usually use a little metal track gauge to make sure that fits there, and again, just making sure everything fits well. Using a little tiny screwdriver, and just slowly from the round side down, you can leverage the tracks out. Now, if you've gone too long with the heat, it's going to be harder. You might have to cut away some plastic with a knife if you let it melt, and better to cut it away than get it out. And then slowly it'll come out, and then you have to do your point rails. They get done as well. And again, it's easier with the ASMR. You can see how I'm doing this whole thing, but you basically put the one rail in proper place up hard against the rail, and then you move it and use again one of the tie gappers in there to set the right space, so you have it offset while it's in the other direction, while it's thrown in the other direction, and then you solder the other point down. And the way I made these, they're basically designed to be the exact same length as the bottom, so I clip the rails right off clean using the zircon cutter from Fast Tracks. And then the last thing you have to do is tie gap it, cut the frogs out. And I made a little jig to help hold you in it, and a sacrificial thing that I can see I've used many times, and you back it through there. And again, I used the Fast Tracks jig for a jeweler's saw for a long time, but I recently bought one again from the same company. I'll link it, and I found that one works a whole lot better. But you have to come at a downwards angle as long as possible, and then start to come over it, because that last little flange is really tough to cut through. And the last thing is attaching it to the tie bed, because I use the printed tie bed I make myself, because now I'm using a linear servo and using Pliobond to attach it to the base. This I can only get from the US, and I got it from Fast Tracks. Haven't been able to find a European version of it. And you dab this on the tie bed and dab it on the rails, and you wait about half hour, let it dry out, put it on and squeeze it together, let it dry together. Last thing is to put the wires on. I usually put the wires on beforehand. In this case, I don't think I would. No, I think they are on there already. That's why it's a bit tough to get it set up underneath with the proper piece of metal. So that's how you build yourself a turnout. Actually, it's 2 hours of actual build time. Of course, little breaks in between the steps. It isn't too long. It's a fun way to spend the night. You know, you can watch a movie or build yourself a turnout. Get it on Cults. Build yourself a model train set, and check it out next time. Thanks for watching. This was Hand-Laid Tracks, but still doesn't have that theme song. Hand-Laid Tracks, but still doesn't have that theme song. Hand-Laid Tracks, gotta get a theme song, need a love theme song. Because it's Hand-Laid Tracks, Hand-Laid Tracks, Hand-Laid Tracks.